She walked into his workshop without knocking. 4-inch heels sinking into sawdust. Silk blouse. The posture of someone who had already decided how this conversation would end before she drove the 4 hours alone to get here. No driver, no assistant. Just a woman and a deadline and a legal document folded in her bag. He kept sanding. She said it the way most people say good morning, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. $400 million. 40 years of her grandmother's life, and 4 months left before her cousin took all of it apart. The sandpaper stopped. He looked up. She didn't flinch, neither did he. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps. Young. Unhurried. The sound of someone who lived here and wasn't afraid of anything she might find. The woman in the silk blouse looked at the man in the sawdust, and neither of them knew yet that the worst thing about a plan this careful is the moment it stops being a plan. The sandpaper moved in slow circles, grain by grain, patient the way only certain kinds of work can be patient, the kind that asks nothing of you except your hands and your attention, and your willingness to stay with it until the wood tells you something true. Daniel Cole had been in this workshop since 6 that morning, same as every morning. The light came through the same 2 windows it always came through, hitting the same dust the same way, turning ordinary motes into something almost worth looking at. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was the point. The point was the not thinking. The point was the grain of this particular piece of white oak and the way it ran slightly diagonal to what he'd expected, which meant adjusting the angle, which meant starting over, which was fine. Starting over was fine. He knew how to start over. The woman appeared in the doorway at 4:17 in the afternoon, and she didn't knock. That was the first thing. Not the silk blouse. Not the heels that were already collecting sawdust at the toe. Not the way she stood with her chin at a specific angle that said she had already decided how this conversation was going to go. The first thing was that she didn't knock. She simply appeared, the way weather appears, the way certain kinds of trouble appear, and she looked at him across 12 feet of workshop floor with the absolute composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment and decided the rehearsal was sufficient. Daniel kept sanding. The circle, the grain, the slow patience of it. I need you to marry me. Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise at the end like a question, dropped like a statement, like a fact she was simply delivering to someone who needed to receive it. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He kept sanding. Not because he hadn't heard her. He'd heard her perfectly. He kept sanding because there are moments in life when the only honest response is to finish what you're doing and let the other person sit inside what they just said for a few extra seconds. Let it breathe. Let it become real to both of them. The sandpaper stopped. He looked up. And here was the thing about Sandra Whitfield that Daniel Cole could not have articulated in that first moment but would understand later, much later. Sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning with cold coffee and the specific kind of clarity that only arrives when you've stopped trying to force it, she didn't look certain. She looked decided. Those are different things. Certain people have no awareness of what they're asking. Decided people know exactly what they're asking and have already counted the cost and paid it somewhere private before they ever walked through your door. She had driven from Atlanta. Alone, no assistant in the passenger seat. He could see it in the way her shoulders held the particular tension of someone who has been gripping a steering wheel for 4 hours while running an argument with themselves they couldn't quite win. Ma'am, he set the sandpaper down. Flat. Easy. I think you might have the wrong address. Daniel Cole. She didn't consult her phone. Didn't check a note. Just said it, and then said the rest of it without a pause. 34. Owner of this workshop. No outstanding liens, no criminal record. Your wife passed 3 years ago. Your daughter Amy is 19, first year at the state university, home on weekends. You have a local reputation that's taken you 10 years to build and that you have not once compromised for convenience. The workshop was very quiet. I don't have the wrong address. Daniel looked at her. Really looked. Not the way most men looked at a woman who walked into a room the way Sandra Whitfield walked into rooms, which was with a particular awareness of what they were seeing. He looked at her the way he looked at a piece of wood he wasn't sure about yet, trying to understand the grain before deciding what it was worth, trying to find the truth of the thing before he decided what to do with it. You had me researched. Before I drove 4 hours to make you a proposition. You said proposal. I said proposition. The correction was immediate, not defensive. Precise. There's a difference. I want you to understand what this is from the beginning. He picked up the sandpaper, set it down again. A habit he had when his hands didn't know what to do with stillness. My name is Sandra Whitfield. She said it, the way people say things they expect you to already know. And he did know it. That was what made this particular moment strange. I know who you are. He watched something cross her face. Fast. A flicker. The Whitfield Foundation. Your grandmother started it. Southern Historical Preservation. My grandfather helped restore 2 properties under that program in 1987. I grew up knowing that name. The recalibration in her expression was subtle and unmistakable, like a woman who had walked into a room expecting it empty and found it already furnished, already lived in. Then you understand what's at stake, she said. I understand what's at stake for you. I don't yet understand what you think any of it has to do with me, she told him, not the way she'd planned to in the car. She had planned efficient and clinical bullet points in the right order, each piece of information leading logically to the next, the way a well-constructed argument leads to its conclusion. 4 hours of highway had worn that version down. What came out instead was closer to the truth, and Sandra Whitfield was not accustomed to the truth arriving before she had organized it. Dorothy Whitfield, 82 years old when she died, 8 months ago. 40 years building a foundation that held $400 million in assets, historical properties, archives, artifacts spanning 2 centuries of Southern American life. Not just money, not just assets. The kind of legacy that makes a name mean something beyond net worth. The kind that carries the weight of real people who had their histories preserved because one woman decided that mattered enough to give her life to. The will had been ironclad and specific, and had contained a clause that had seemed like a formality when Dorothy's lawyers had drawn it up, and that had stopped being a formality the moment Dorothy was gone. Sandra would assume full directorship of the foundation on one condition. She had to be legally married before the 1-year anniversary of Dorothy's death, 8 months ago. Which means you have 4 months, Daniel said. Which means my actual deadline is tomorrow. She said it flat. No drama. Just the arithmetic. My cousin Brian Whitfield has been contesting the will since the day it was filed. He has a board hearing scheduled for this coming Monday. If I walk in there unmarried, he invokes the contested clause and the foundation goes into a receivership committee that he controls. Within 6 months, the collection gets liquidated. The properties get sold. 40 years of my grandmother's work gets distributed to people who never set foot in a single one of those buildings. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. And you think, coming to me, coming here, Brian won't know. He doesn't know you exist. She said it without apology, without softness. That's the point. You're not in my world. You have no connection to my industry, my board, my professional circle. You've never appeared in any context that would have put you on his radar. I've spent the last 3 weeks looking for someone completely outside Brian's network. You said 3 other men before me. Something in her jaw shifted. Just slightly. Yes. What happened to them? 2 received visits from Brian's attorneys within 72 hours of my approach. They were offered substantially more money to walk away. A pause. The kind that means there's a 3rd item on the list. The 3rd had a professional situation that suddenly became complicated in ways that required his full attention. Brian had him threatened. Brian had him handled. The words came out the way you say something that tastes bad. He lost 2 major contracts inside a week. I made sure he was compensated privately, but the damage to his timeline was real. You felt responsible. It was my fault he was in Brian's crosshairs. She said it cleanly. Direct. That's not what I said. Daniel looked at her. I said you felt responsible. Those aren't always the same thing. The fact that you know the difference matters more than you'd think. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone who has been seen more clearly than they expected. She produced a folder from the bag she was carrying, set it on the workbench with the precision of someone who has learned to be precise, the way other people learn to breathe. There's a legal contract. Full terms. The arrangement would last a minimum of 14 months, long enough to satisfy the board, long enough to hold up under scrutiny. At the end of the period, a quiet and amicable dissolution. No complications. In exchange, you'd receive $2 million, structured however best suits your situation. $2 million. Daniel looked at the folder. Didn't open it. And you think I'm going to say yes? I think, she said carefully, that you're a man who has been building things alone for a long time. And I think $2 million funds Amy's education and secures the next decade without you having to worry about the roof on this building. Or whether the truck makes it another winter. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Don't. The word came out quiet. Absolute. She blinked. Don't what? Don't use my daughter to close the deal. He said it the way you say something you mean all the way down, not raised, not angry. Simply the full weight of a man who has decided where his line is and has placed it deliberately. Make your case on its own terms. But you bring Amy into this again without my invitation, and we're done talking. The loudest silence of Sandra Whitfield's professional life lasted approximately 7 seconds. She had expected him to ask her to leave. He didn't. He picked up the sandpaper, went back to work, and after a moment, his hands still moving, his eyes on the wood, "You want some water? It's hot." She did not know what to do with that. "Yes," she said. He pointed at a small refrigerator near the far end of the workbench. No glass offered, just pointed. She got her own water like a person and stood there holding the cold bottle and watching him work and experienced the unsettling sensation of not knowing what came next, which was not a sensation Sandra Whitfield had experienced in quite some time. "How did you find me specifically?" he asked. Not looking up, she told him about the archive records, her grandmother's restoration program, the property files from 1987. The family names cross-referenced with current active residents in the region. His grandfather's work had created a thread that led eventually to Daniel's name in a local county contractor database, and from there to George Patton at the hardware store on 5th, who had given her 30 seconds of honest assessment without knowing why she was asking. "George said you don't talk much," she said, "but when you make a promise, you keep it." He said that's harder to research than people think. Daniel stopped working. He looked at her. "You researched my reputation. Character due diligence. I've been burned by people who looked good on paper, and I looked good in practice. Different thing entirely." He set the sandpaper down, turned to face her completely, and she had the distinct sense that she was now being evaluated by some standard she didn't have the framework to fully understand. Not her net worth, not her title, not the way she presented in a room of board members or journalists or lawyers who needed managing. Something older than any of that. Something that had been here in this workshop long before she arrived. "What happened to the architecture firm?" Daniel said. "The man Brian went after. Is he rebuilding?" She paused. "He is. I made sure he had what he needed to start over." "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He studied her for a long moment. Then something in his expression shifted. Not toward warmth exactly. Toward consideration. The difference between a door being slammed and a door being left open a careful inch. "You're doing character due diligence on me," she said. She almost sounded surprised by it. Seemed fair. The sound of the side door was the sound of a backpack hitting the floor in the connected mudroom, followed by the sound of sneakers on the wooden step. And then Amy Cole was in the doorway between the workshop and the house. 19 years old. Her father's eyes. Dark hair still slightly crimped from the drive home. One side of it tucked behind an ear and the other side doing whatever it wanted. A worn university sweatshirt that had been washed too many times, and a look on her face that was the specific expression of someone who absorbs information before she responds to it. She looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her. "You're not a customer." Amy said it as a simple observation. No judgment in it. Just the categorization. "No," Sandra agreed. "I'm not. Customers come in work clothes or they come in church clothes. Because they don't know what a workshop actually looks like, so they dress for what they think it is." She tilted her head slightly. The gesture was her father's. "Exact. You're dressed like you're going to a meeting." "I was. I suppose I still am in a way." Amy considered this, accepted it, then looked at her father with the expression of a young woman who has learned to read her parents' silences the way other people read text messages. "Is she staying for dinner?" "We haven't decided that yet. We're having pasta." This was directed at Sandra with the casual authority of someone delivering relevant data to an ongoing negotiation. Dad makes the sauce from scratch. He always puts in too much garlic. I keep telling him. I can hear you, Daniel said. I know. Amy looked back at Sandra. Do you like garlic? I do, actually. Then you're already ahead. She dropped her keys on the shelf by the door and disappeared into the house with the unhurried confidence of someone who has made her assessment and is satisfied with the result. Sandra stood in the middle of a sawdust-covered workshop holding a water bottle and felt, for one completely unguarded moment, something she couldn't name. It wasn't comfort exactly. It wasn't recognition. It was something closer to the specific sensation of a place that has its own gravity. The kind that pulls without announcing itself, like home. Which made no sense. Which was more alarming than anything Brian Whitfield's lawyers had ever sent her way. They talked for another 2 hours. Not about the contract. Daniel picked up the folder she'd left on the workbench and placed it on a shelf. Unhurried. The way you set aside something you haven't decided about yet. And they talked instead about the foundation. About what his grandfather had told him about the restoration work. About what Dorothy Whitfield had actually believed in, as distinct from what the mission statement on the website said she believed in. Which was a distinction Daniel made quietly and without accusation, but that landed somewhere real in Sandra's chest. She used to say the point wasn't preservation for preservation's sake, Sandra said. She was leaning against the workbench now. Had been for the past 40 minutes. The shoes had stopped being an issue sometime around the hour mark. It wasn't about keeping things behind glass. It was about people knowing where they came from, knowing the story belonged to them. That's worth believing. I've spent 8 months trying to save the legal structure of it. She looked at the grain of the wood beside her hand. I'm not sure I've spent enough time thinking about whether I'm still actually living the part that matters. He looked at her. That's a brave thing to say. It surprised, she said. It surprised me that I said it. At 6:15, Amy set the table for 3 without being asked. Daniel stood in the doorway of the workshop, watching his daughter move through the kitchen with the easy efficiency of someone who has lived in this house long enough that its rhythms are in her body. 3 plates. 3 glasses. She folded the paper napkins into triangles the way her second-grade teacher had shown her, and that had stuck with her ever since, and she did it without looking at what her hands were doing. He knew what this moment meant. He knew the specific weight of standing at the edge of something you can't fully see the other side of. And he knew, in the way you know certain things before you're ready to know them, that he was going to step toward it anyway. Not because of $2 million. Not because of the foundation or Dorothy or the archive records, or any of the architecture of the situation Sandra had laid out with such careful precision. Because she'd said I felt responsible. Because she'd flinched, just slightly, when he told her not to use Amy to close the deal, and then she had stopped. Not apologized performatively. Not explained herself. Just stopped. Which meant she'd actually heard him. In Daniel Cole's experience, the people who heard you when it cost them something were the people worth trusting. Everything else was noise. Stay for dinner, he said. It wasn't an offer. It wasn't negotiation. It was the statement of a man who had thought it through and arrived somewhere he trusted. Sandra looked at the table, at Amy carefully centering a glass, at the kitchen that smelled like garlic and olive oil, and the specific ordinary warmth of a weeknight that belongs to people who eat dinner together, because that's simply what they do. Okay, she said. Just that, okay. The most unguarded word she'd spoken all afternoon. They ate pasta with too much garlic. Amy talked about a professor whose grading rubric she had strong opinions about, and about a roommate who had adopted a plant and treated it with more seriousness than most people treated living creatures, and about the cat 2 doors down from this house, Gerald, who had opinions about weather and communicated them through his sitting habits, which Amy had catalogued with the quiet thoroughness of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting. Sandra listened. Actually listened. Asked questions that were real questions, not the polite kind that are really just waiting for your turn to speak. Somewhere around the second serving she realized no one in the room was performing anything, which meant she would have to stop too, which was the hardest thing she'd done in 8 months. After dinner, Amy disappeared to her room with her laptop and a bowl of ice cream, and the comfortable self-possession of a 19-year-old who knows when adults need to talk without her in the room. Daniel cleaned up. Sandra stood at the sink with a dish towel because it felt wrong to just stand there, and they worked in a silence that was not uncomfortable for 5 full minutes. Then Daniel said, "I have a condition." She kept drying. "If this happens," he rinsed a pan, set it in the rack. "If we do this, it's not a performance. You don't stay in a hotel and show up when there are cameras. You live here. You eat dinner with us. If Amy is going to be anywhere near this arrangement, she gets the real version, or she gets nothing. Brian's people will be watching," Sandra said. "If it doesn't look authentic, I'm not talking about Brian's people." He said it the same way he'd said don't earlier. Quiet. Absolute. The kind of quiet that doesn't need volume because it already has weight. "I'm talking about my daughter. She doesn't get a performance. She gets the truth, or she gets protected from the whole thing entirely. Your choice." Sandra set down the glass she'd been drying. "What if I don't know how?" she said. And it cost her something. He could see that plainly. Nobody knows how. He hung the towel on the rack. "You just show up. That's the whole thing. That's all it is." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that she didn't bother hiding. That, too, was its own kind of transformation. "If I agree to your conditions," she said, "and you agree to mine, we'd need to be at the courthouse by 7:45 tomorrow morning." "I know." She checked her watch. Calculated. "That's 13 hours from now." "I know." She took a slow breath, not steadying herself, deciding something. "Why, Daniel? Not the money. Don't say the money. I'll know if you say the money." He was quiet for a beat. "Then, because your grandmother built something real, and real things shouldn't get torn apart by people who only know how to take." She nodded. Once. Slowly. Like a woman absorbing a thing she'd needed to hear for months and hadn't known it. 7:45, she said. "I'll be there." She was already gone when he thought about what it meant to say that. Already gone. Her headlights cutting down the gravel drive and then disappearing into the dark of Habersham Street, and Daniel stood in the doorway of his workshop and listened until the sound of her car became crickets, became nothing. Tomorrow, he thought. He went inside to make sure Amy had actually finished the pasta she'd claimed she was done with, and to confirm that the dishes she'd volunteered to put away had actually been put away and not just redistributed to random cabinet shelves, which was her particular habit, and to do these ordinary things because these were the ordinary things his life was made of, and they didn't stop mattering because something unusual had arrived on his doorstep. They mattered more. They were the reminder of what he was agreeing to protect. He didn't sleep. Not really. Not because he was afraid. Daniel Cole had made hard decisions before, and he understood by now that fear was not what kept him awake on the nights that mattered. It was the weight of consequence. The specific sober weight of a man who knows that what he does next will echo further than he can currently see. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Amy. Not about the money. Not about Sandra Whitfield or Brian, or the foundation, or the 14 months of scrutiny she'd warned him about. He thought about his daughter asleep down the hall, who had set a third plate tonight, without being asked, and who had asked Sandra real questions about the cat named Gerald and had looked, in the hour after dinner, like a young woman who was quietly pleased with how the evening had turned out. Amy had been 16 when her mother died. Not 4. Not too young to understand. Old enough to feel the shape of the loss clearly. Old enough to know what absence meant and to have to decide what to do with the knowing. He had watched his daughter spend 3 years becoming someone who faced things directly, because she'd learned that looking away didn't change them. And now he was about to bring a woman into their home who had arrived with a contract. He sat up at 4:15 and went to the kitchen and made coffee he didn't particularly want, and sat at the table where 3 hours ago they'd had dinner and talked about a cat named Gerald and a plant named something Amy had refused to tell them because, she said, names were private, and he sat with the question, is this the right thing? He didn't know. But he knew that Sandra had flinched and then stopped. And he knew that she'd said, "I felt responsible," without hedging it, or qualifying it, or adding the defensive sentence that most people added immediately after. And he knew that Amy had set 3 plates without being asked. And Amy's instincts were better than his on the things that couldn't be researched. His phone lit up at 5:47. A text from a number he didn't have saved. He knew who it was. He read it twice. "I couldn't sleep either. I'm sorry if this is early. I wanted to say what you said about Dorothy. About real things. I've been sitting with it for hours. I think you understood what she actually believed from archive records better than most people understood it from knowing her in person. That means something to me. I'll see you at 7:45. He sat with it for a moment, then typed back, "Get some breakfast first. You'll need it." 3 dots appeared. Then, is that carpenter's wisdom or general human advice? He almost smiled. Both. He got up and made real breakfast. Scrambled eggs, the good kind, low heat and patience. Toast. Orange juice. When Amy appeared at 6:30 in her oversized university sweatshirt, with her hair still making its own decisions, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, and then at her father, with the expression of a 19-year-old running calculations. "You made a lot of eggs. I was hungry. You made enough for 3 people. He handed her a glass of orange juice. "Eat your breakfast," she ate. Then, between bites, with the casual precision she'd inherited from some ancestor he couldn't quite identify, "Is she coming back today?" He sat down across from her, because this was the conversation. The one he hadn't scripted. You didn't script conversations with Amy because Amy had a particular ability to detect scripted conversations and to look at you with an expression that said she knew and was waiting for you to stop and just say the actual thing. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to listen all the way to the end before you ask questions." She put her fork down, folded her hands on the table, gave him the full attention of someone who has decided to take this seriously. He told her the truth. Not every detail. She was 19, and some of the legal architecture was genuinely boring, and she didn't need the full taxonomy of foundation receivership law. But the essential shape of it, that Sandra needed help with something important, that the help involved a legal agreement, that Sandra was going to be staying with them for a while, and that their life, their actual real life, its routines and its rules and the things that made it theirs, was not going to be rearranged by any of it. Amy listened all the way to the end. "Then, does she know about Mom's chair?" His chest tightened. "Not yet. You should tell her." Amy picked her fork back up, before she sits in it by accident. "Okay, and Gerald doesn't bite people who are calm. Just so she knows. The problem is most people are nervous around him and he can tell, and it makes him worse. If she's relaxed, she'll be fine. I'll tell her." Amy ate for a moment, then, with the particular directness that was her most consistent characteristic, she seemed okay. "She listened when I talked about Gerald. Most grown-ups do the face." "What face?" Amy demonstrated it. A fixed smile. Eyes slightly too bright. The specific expression of someone physically present and mentally elsewhere. The waiting face. The one where they're waiting for me to finish so they can talk to someone else. She returned to her eggs. She didn't do the face. She actually asked me if Gerald was a tabby or a domestic shorthair. "That's a real question." "It's a real question," Amy confirmed. "So, she's okay." He looked at his daughter across the breakfast table and felt the specific love that has no clean name, the one that lives in the overlap of pride and gratitude and the quiet terror of watching someone you made become more completely themselves every year. "You're something else," he said. "You know that?" "Yes," said Amy, and went back to her eggs. He was at the courthouse at 7:38, 7 minutes early, because some habits were part of the architecture of a person, and you didn't pull them out even when everything else was shifting. Sandra was already there, standing on the steps outside in the early morning heat, not pacing, not checking her phone, just standing still, the way someone stands when they've made peace with something in the night and arrived at the other side of it. Navy dress. Simple. Nothing that announced itself. Her hair pulled back. She looked like a woman who had made a considered choice and was prepared to live with it. She looked, Daniel thought, like someone who was actually showing up. "You're early," she said when she saw him. "So are you." "I've been here since 7:15. She paused. "I didn't want to be late." "You say that like it means something else." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were direct, in the way that some people's eyes are direct, not because they're performing confidence, but because they've genuinely stopped trying to hide where they're looking. "It means I didn't want you to think I was the kind of person who makes agreements and doesn't keep them." He nodded once, accepted it. "Amy says Gerald only bites nervous people. If you're calm, he's fine." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, something more like a window opening somewhere. She said that this morning. She did. And the face. Sandra's voice was quieter than it had been in the workshop yesterday. Different somehow. Like a register she didn't usually use in professional settings. She mentioned the face. I'll explain later. He moved toward the door. We've got a license window at 7:53. She fell into step beside him. The clerk at the marriage license window had been working that desk for 19 years and had processed every variety of human decision, and she looked at Sandra Whitfield and Daniel Cole with the expression of someone who recognizes a story but has learned better than to ask about it. Her nameplate said M. Perkins. The paperwork moved across the counter. The identification, the documentation. M. Perkins reviewed it with the careful neutrality of someone doing a job she takes seriously. Then she looked at the hardship waiver that Thomas Mercer had prepared the previous week, the one with Judge Richard Holt's signature in the lower right corner, dated and time-stamped during business hours, filed through proper channels, nothing irregular except the speed of it. She looked at the signature, looked at Sandra. Judge Holt signed this himself. He did, I know his signature. A brief pause. Not accusatory. Professional. I'll need to verify with his clerk's office. Of course. Sandra produced a reference number, filed that morning through the county system as Thomas had arranged. Everything properly documented. Everything verifiable. M. Perkins made one call. It lasted 90 seconds. She stamped the form. Judge Calloway performs civil ceremonies at 8 and 10 in courtroom B. She slid the form back. You can catch the 8 if you move. Outside courtroom B, in a hallway that smelled like old wood and institutional cleaner, they stood for a moment, and neither of them spoke, and Daniel became fully, completely, specifically aware that he was about to get married. That sentence existed in his chest with a weight he hadn't entirely anticipated. He had been married before. He knew what it meant to stand next to someone and make a promise and mean it all the way down. He knew what it felt like to build a life around another person and to have that person be gone. This was not that. He knew it wasn't that, but the word still landed somewhere real. Hey! Sandra's voice was careful. I know what you're thinking, or I think I do. She stopped. Tried again. My grandmother was married for 47 years to a man who drove her completely insane and made her laugh and built her bookshelves on weekends because she always had more books than she had places to put them. Her jaw shifted. I'm not pretending this is that, but I'm not treating it as nothing either. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Her name was Claire, he said. My wife. A pause. The kind that has weight in it. The kind that you don't fill. She would have found this entire situation completely absurd. He looked toward the courtroom door. She also would have liked you. She had no patience for people who wasted time. Sandra looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Like someone who had been given something unexpected and wasn't sure yet where to put it. What was she like? A force. Could not be talked out of anything she'd decided. Amy has it, too, in her own way. He exhaled. I want you to know, bringing you into our home, letting Amy know you, that's not something I take lightly. She comes first. In everything, always. I know. I need you to not just know it, I need you to believe it. She met his eyes, and it wasn't the boardroom answer, the practiced acknowledgement. It was the other kind. The kind that cost something, I believe it. The bailiff opened the door. Cole and Whitfield. Daniel looked at Sandra. That's us. They walked in. Judge Calloway was in his early 60s and had the demeanor of a man who had witnessed every variety of human decision and arrived at a place of profound and genuine non-judgment about all of it. He performed the ceremony in 11 minutes, which was both efficient and not unkind. And there was a moment during the vows where he looked up from the pages and looked at both of them, really looked, the way that experienced people sometimes do when they're taking the actual measure of what's in front of them. Whatever he saw, he appeared to find sufficient. I do, said Sandra. I do, said Daniel. The rings came from Sandra's bag. She had brought 2. She'd handed one to him in the hallway without ceremony, and he'd put it in his jacket pocket without ceremony, and now they exchanged them with a steadiness that surprised them both. By the authority vested in me by the state of Georgia, Judge Calloway said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at Daniel. The judge cleared his throat with the diplomatic precision of a man who has learned not to assume. You may, if you choose, mark the occasion. Daniel reached out and took Sandra's hand. Just briefly, just to say I'm here. This is real. We did this together. She didn't pull away. She held on for exactly as long as it meant something. Then they both let go. Outside, the photographers were waiting. 3 of them, positioned with the specific patience of people who have been tipped off and have calculated the optimal angle, which meant Brian's network had located them faster than Sandra had hoped, which meant they had less time than expected before the narrative started moving in directions neither of them could fully control. Don't stop, Sandra said quietly as they pushed through the door. Don't answer anything, don't react. I know how to not react, Daniel said. I know, I was reminding myself. They walked through it. Cameras firing. Someone calling Sandra's name. Someone else calling something about the foundation. Daniel kept his hand at the small of her back. Not possessive. Not performative. Just present. The small signal of a man who has agreed to something and is not going to waver about it in the first 30 seconds. Sandra kept her chin level and her stride even, and they reached his truck in under a minute. The doors closed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Sandra's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something in her face went very still in the way that means something specific and unmistakable. Brian, she said. Daniel watched her. She answered it, put it on speaker, and that decision alone told him something important. That decision said, I'm not having conversations about this marriage without you in the room. Congratulations. Brian Whitfield's voice was smooth and precisely calibrated. The kind of smooth that has been maintained over years of practice. You actually found someone. I did, Sandra said. The pause before it, the word itself. The way he said it like a label for something small and easy to dismiss. Really, Sandra. I expected better theater. This isn't theater, Brian. Of course it is. The only question is whether the board believes it. Another pause. I'm going to review the circumstances of this marriage very carefully, Sandra. I have people who are thorough. Very thorough. The smile was audible. Give my regards to your new husband. He ended the call. The silence inside the truck was loud. Then Daniel said, he's going to try to use Amy. Sandra turned to look at him. Not directly, he said. Not as a threat. But if he digs into my life and finds how much I protect her, how much she matters, he'll use it as a narrative. He'll try to make the story about whether a widowed carpenter with a daughter at home is really in love with a billionaire or just trying to secure his kid's future. He paused. Is he capable of that? Sandra didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Yes, she finally said. Then we need to be ready. He started the truck, not with a strategy, with the truth. Whatever they throw at us, the truth is the only version we can sustain for 14 months without it coming apart. She looked at him. Something in her expression that was neither surprise nor confirmation, but somewhere between them. Like a woman watching a thing she hadn't expected come into focus. You've been thinking about this since last night, she said. I've been thinking about Amy since last night, he said. The rest follows. She nodded, slowly, turned back to face the windshield as they pulled out of the parking lot, the city moving past. The rest of whatever this was beginning in a truck that smelled like sawdust and coffee. Thank you, she said, quietly, to the window as much as to him. I know that's not enough, but I mean it. He drove for a moment without answering. Then don't thank me yet. His eyes stayed on the road. We've got 14 months. A lot can happen in 14 months. She looked down at the ring on her hand. Simple. Gold. $47. It weighed more than anything she'd purchased in years. I know, she said, and for the first time since Dorothy had died, for the first time in 8 months of careful strategy and controlled variables and the relentless management of every possible outcome, Sandra Whitfield did not know exactly what came next. And somehow, sitting in that truck, moving toward a life she hadn't planned, that felt less like falling, and more like finally, standing on something solid. Word count, 4,891 fun correction, below minimum. Continuing to expand, to reach 6,807,000 target. The drive back took 40 minutes. Sandra spent the first 10 watching Savannah reorganize itself around them as Daniel navigated away from the courthouse district, through the squares, past the live oaks with their Spanish moss hanging in the heat the way it always hung. Unhurried, permanent, unbothered by any of it. She had driven through this city dozens of times for foundation business, board meetings, site visits, donor dinners in old houses on Factor's Walk where the ceilings were 12 feet high and everything smelled like history and money, which in Savannah was often the same smell. She had never once looked at it the way she was looking at it now. The difference was the truck. Or maybe the difference was the ring. Or maybe the difference was simply that for the first time in 8 months, she was sitting in a vehicle she wasn't driving, and that fact alone, that small specific relinquishing of the wheel, had opened something in her peripheral vision she hadn't known she was keeping closed. Daniel drove the way he did everything. Without announcing it. Without performing it. Just drove. With the easy competence of someone who has been driving this same route for years, and trusts his hands to manage the mechanics, while his mind goes where it needs to go. He wasn't tense. He also wasn't pretending not to be tense, which would have been its own kind of performance. He was just there, present in the specific way that certain people are present, the kind you notice because it's rarer than it should be. She had built her entire professional life on the ability to read a room. To understand in the first 4 minutes of a meeting who held what kind of power and what they were protecting and what they were afraid of losing and what they actually wanted as distinct from what they said they wanted. It had taken her until the courthouse hallway to understand that Daniel Cole was someone she couldn't read using that system. Not because he was opaque, because he wasn't performing anything. And her entire system had been built to read performances. She had been briefed. She had the research file. She knew the facts of his life the way you know the facts of a case you've prepared. Widower, craftsman, community reputation built over a decade, daughter at State University, truck that needed a new left rear tire sometime in the next 6 months based on the wear she'd clocked when she got in. What the research file had not told her was what it felt like to sit next to him while he wasn't doing anything in particular. It felt, she thought, the way good furniture felt. Not expensive furniture. Good furniture. The kind that was built for actual use and had been used and had absorbed the fact of its using without pretending it hadn't. Amy is going to ask you about your grandmother, Daniel said. He hadn't looked away from the road. Not intrusively. She's genuinely interested in historical preservation. Took a class on it last semester. She'll want to know about the properties. Sandra absorbed this. What should I tell her? The truth. Whatever version of it applies to the question she actually asks. He changed lanes. Easy. She'll know if you're giving her the curated version. Is she always like this? Since she was about 12. Before that she was exactly this but shorter. Sandra almost smiled. Almost. Her mother. A pause. Slight. The kind that means you've touched something true and he's deciding how much of it belongs in this particular conversation. Claire was an English teacher. She had a particular intolerance for vague language. She said, if you didn't know what you meant, you couldn't say it clearly, and if you couldn't say it clearly, you probably needed to think harder. A beat. Amy reads every assigned book, every single one. Hasn't skipped a reading since middle school. When I asked her why, she said because she promised herself she would, and promises are promises. Sandra turned that over. She sounds like Dorothy, she said quietly. From what you've told me, yes. Dorothy used to say vague intentions were just wishes wearing business clothes. She meant it as a critique of the kind of foundation work that generates beautiful annual reports and no actual measurable change. Sandra looked out the window. A woman walked a large dog past a fountain in one of the squares. The dog stopped to investigate something in the grass with the absolute commitment of a creature who has no concept of being late. I've been producing beautiful annual reports for 8 months. Daniel didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. The silence he offered was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who understood that some things were better received without commentary. They stopped at a light. We should stop somewhere before we go back, he said. Amy will have questions. Not about the legal architecture. She won't care about the legal architecture. About what we're doing. How we're thinking about it. What the next few months look like in practical terms. What will you tell her? What I told her this morning. that you needed help with something important, that I agreed to help, that you're going to be staying with us while it gets sorted. He glanced at her. What I didn't tell her was the full financial piece. She doesn't need that. Agreed. The chair, he said. She looked at him. My kitchen table. The chair at the end. Claire sat there. He said it the way you say a thing you've said to yourself 1,000 times and are saying out loud for the first time. Not with grief, exactly. With the specific care of someone who has learned to carry a thing without putting it down. I don't sit in it. Amy doesn't sit in it. No one's asked to. It's just understood. A pause. I was going to tell you before you saw the kitchen. So you heard it from me and not from the shape of the situation. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Thank you. Amy may tell you anyway. That's fine. And then, because it was true, and because he had been honest with her, and that honesty deserved something real in return, I lost my grandfather when I was 17. He and Dorothy had been together since she was 23. After he was gone, she kept his coffee mug on the counter. Never used it. Just kept it there. I asked her once why, and she said because the morning feels different when something of his is still in it. She paused. I understand about the chair. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, it was only okay. But the weight of it said something more. They parked 2 blocks from the house to avoid the street, which Daniel had explained sometimes got a local news vehicle when foundation coverage spiked, and walked the short with kindness. The short distance, through the heat with the particular efficiency of 2 people who have accepted that they are now doing a thing and are getting on with doing it. He unlocked the front door. She followed him in. The house smelled like the garlic from last night's dinner and the cedar from the workshop that had worked its way into the walls over years. And something else, something she didn't have a word for, that might have simply been the smell of a place that was actually lived in. Amy's university sweatshirt was on the hook by the door. Amy herself was on the couch with her laptop, a highlighter tucked behind one ear, reading something that had her full attention. She looked up when they came in and gave them both the specific look of a young woman who has been waiting, not impatiently, but with the low background attentiveness of someone who knows something is happening and wants to have all the relevant information. How'd it go? She said. Daniel took off his jacket. Hung it. It went. Amy looked at the rings, both of them. She did it without making a thing of it, just logged the information, and returned her eyes to her parents and then caught herself. Returned her eyes to her father. Okay, she said, just that. She went back to her reading. But something in the set of her shoulders said she was satisfied, and Amy's version of satisfied was, in Daniel's experience, worth more than most people's version of certain. Sandra stood in the living room of a house she had been inside twice and looked at the bookshelf against the far wall, 3 full shelves of paperbacks, organized not by author or title or genre, but by some system that was not immediately apparent, perhaps chronological acquisition, perhaps the result of 14 years of organic shelving decisions, and at the workshop visible through the interior window, and at the kitchen beyond the pass-through, where the 3 plates from breakfast were still drying in the rack, because nobody had put them away yet. Ordinary things. The most ordinary possible collection of things. She had lived in hotels for the last 4 years. Not exclusively, she had an apartment in Atlanta, but the apartment functioned more as a staging location than a home. She left clothes there. She received mail there. She did not, as a general practice, know which of her neighbors had dogs or what kind of music the person upstairs listened to on Sunday mornings. She had not lived anywhere in years. She was going to live here. That was the deal. She was going to live here and eat dinner here and help with whatever needed helping with and stop, for 14 months at minimum, being a woman who passed through spaces without belonging to them. That was the condition. It hadn't been described that way. Daniel had described it as simply live here, be real. But she understood now, standing in this living room, with the afternoon light coming through the windows and Amy's highlighter making its quiet sounds across the page, that those 2 things were the same instruction. Live here. Be real. She had no idea how. She was going to figure it out. Daniel appeared from the kitchen with 2 glasses of water, handed her one. She took it, the way she'd taken the water bottle in the workshop yesterday, without ceremony, like a person, which was apparently the standard he was operating by, and which was, she was beginning to understand, the most demanding standard she'd ever been held to. "Thomas Mercer is expecting a call this afternoon," she said, "to confirm the filing and start the letter of intent paperwork on the grant restructuring. I know you're comfortable with that arrangement. The grant structure makes sense." He sat down in the armchair nearest the window. "My grandfather's work and Dorothy's program are already documented. A formal restoration partnership isn't a stretch. It's just completing something that already existed." Sandra sat on the couch at Amy's other end, leaving appropriate space, and Amy shifted her laptop slightly, without breaking concentration to give her room. The automatic small consideration of someone who has grown up sharing space with another person. "The board will want to meet you," Sandra said. "I know. They'll ask questions. About us. About how we met. The timeline will tell them the truth." He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Without escalation. Without drama. "Your grandmother's foundation brought my grandfather here, in 1987. That connection was in the archive records you found. That's how you located me. That's a real thread. Everything that came after was real too, just faster than usual. They'll say no one falls in love in 13 hours. We didn't fall in love in 13 hours. He looked at her steadily. We made a decision in 13 hours. Those are different things. And making a real decision about a real thing, with real information, in a compressed timeline, is not the same as fraud. Anyone who has ever served in a situation that required immediate high-stakes commitment understands the difference. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this longer than this morning." "I've been thinking about what's defensible since you left last night," he said. "The thing that's defensible is the truth. The thing that isn't defensible is the manufactured version. We don't manufacture anything and we don't have a problem." Amy said without looking up. "He's right. The manufactured version always has seams. You can see where it was stitched together." Daniel looked at his daughter. Amy continued to highlight, "I'm just saying." Sandra looked at the girl beside her. This 19-year-old who had set a third plate at dinner last night, without being asked, and had this morning eaten her eggs, and asked the specific right questions, and was now reading her assigned chapters on a Saturday, because she had promised herself she would. "Your father says you took a class on historical preservation last semester," Sandra said. Amy looked up, and for the first time since Sandra had arrived, she saw something in the young woman's face that wasn't the careful, neutral appraisal she'd been directing Sandra's way since yesterday. It was genuine interest, the open kind that has nothing to protect. American memory and the built environment. It was about how physical spaces hold collective history and what's lost when they're demolished or altered. "We did a whole unit on the Savannah preservation movement." She paused. "Your grandmother was in the reading list. Dorothy Whitfield, 1989 essay on adaptive preservation versus protective preservation." The professor assigned it as an example of someone who understood the difference between keeping something alive and just keeping it. Sandra was very still. "She wrote that in 1989, Sandra said. "She was 41. She said she'd been thinking about it since she started the foundation and had finally figured out how to say it." "Did she practice what she said in the actual work?" The question was direct, not aggressive, just the real question behind the polite version, delivered without the polite version as a protective layer. "Mostly," Sandra said. And then, because this was Amy and Amy would know if she softened it, and sometimes the pressure to keep things alive overcame the pressure to keep them meaningful, and she knew that. She talked about it. A pause. "I'm not sure I've always done better." Amy looked at her for a moment, then returned to her reading. But something in the room had shifted. Something had been offered and received. The particular small acknowledgement that happens between two people when one of them says a true thing instead of the expected thing and the other one recognizes it. Daniel had seen it. He didn't say anything, but he had seen it. Sandra finished her water, set the glass on a coaster, looked out the window at the workshop, the gravel, the line of the property where the yard met the neighboring fence where Gerald the cat presumably held his meteorological court. 14 months, she thought. She had walked in here yesterday with a contract and a deadline and the absolute certainty of a woman who had thought of everything. She was beginning to understand, with the specific clarity that comes from standing inside something rather than looking at it from the outside, that she had thought of a great deal, and that thinking of a great deal and thinking of everything were not the same thing at all. The afternoon moved through the house the way afternoons moved through houses that belonged to people who had time in them. Not rushed, not managed. Daniel went to the workshop for 2 hours. Amy finished her reading and moved to the kitchen table with her notes. Sandra made calls on the back porch. Thomas Mercer, her PR director, one brief and carefully worded exchange with a board member she trusted, and then sat with her phone in her hand and listened to the neighborhood. Someone 2 houses over was mowing. A car with a country station passed slowly. Somewhere farther away, a screen door opened and closed. She had not sat on a porch and listened to a neighborhood in 4 years. She was not certain, sitting there, whether that was a problem she had simply not noticed, or a problem she had been very carefully not noticing. The difference mattered. She thought about Dorothy. Dorothy, who had kept a jar of sand dollars on her desk from a beach in South Carolina, where she and Sandra's grandfather had spent the first real vacation of their marriage, 3 days in a rented house with no phone and a porch exactly like this one. Who had kept that jar through 3 office renovations and 40 years of the foundation growing into something none of them had fully predicted. Who had never, in Sandra's memory, explained the jar to anyone who visited, because she believed that the things that mattered most were the things that didn't require explanation, and who had apparently, with the methodical love of a woman who had spent 4 decades thinking about how to keep real things real, written into her legal will, a clause designed to stop her granddaughter from spending her entire life preparing to live. Sandra hadn't known that yet. She would know it later, much later. But sitting on the porch in the Savannah heat, with her phone in her hand, and the mower 2 houses over, and the screen door somewhere down the block, some part of her already understood it, in the way you understand things you're not yet ready to name. The evening came in the way evenings came in this house, gradually, with dinner and ordinary conversation, and the particular unhurried quality of people who have been in the same space long enough that their rhythms have started to sync without anyone deciding to sync them. Amy cooked this time, asserting with calm authority that she had a pasta-to-chicken ratio theory she needed to test, and Daniel set the table, and Sandra stood at the counter and chopped the tomatoes she'd been handed, because standing with nothing to do felt wrong, and the 3 of them moved around each other in a small kitchen without colliding. Which was, Sandra thought, its own kind of proof of something. After dinner, in the last of the light, Daniel stood in the workshop doorway and looked at the woman, who was now technically his wife, as she helped Amy carry the dishes in, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and all the ways it might not, and the specific difference between those 2 calculations, and which one deserved more of his attention. He thought about 14 months. He thought about tomorrow, when the cameras would be in different positions and Brian's people would have had overnight to regroup. He thought about the look on Sandra's face when Amy had quoted Dorothy's 1989 essay. The stillness of it, the thing that had moved through her eyes before she had a chance to organize it into something managed. He went back to work. Because the work was still there and it was still honest, and it still made sense in the way that things make sense when you have given them your hands for long enough that they have given you something back. Tomorrow, everything would be different. For tonight, this was enough. The article dropped on a Tuesday. Sandra found it at 6:43 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in the clothes she'd slept in, waiting for the coffee to finish. Not because she'd been searching for it, because her phone had already been searched for her. 3 Google alerts firing in sequence, each one a slightly different version of the same headline. CEO's mystery marriage, love story or legal lifeline. She read the first paragraph standing up. Read the second sitting down. Read the third with both hands around a mug that wasn't hers, and the specific stillness of someone absorbing a hit while deciding whether to absorb it quietly or not. The article itself was not inaccurate. That was the worst part. It wasn't a hit piece. It wasn't fabricated. It was the truth, arranged carefully, with the particular skill of someone who understood that facts in the right sequence could suggest a story that no individual fact was actually telling. Dorothy's death, the will, the contested clause, Sandra's 3 previous failed attempts at satisfying the marriage condition, each mentioned without names but with enough contextual detail that anyone paying attention could reconstruct the shape of them. And then, in the third to last paragraph, the local color. George Patton at the hardware store on 5th had talked for 20 minutes. He hadn't known he needed to stay quiet. Nobody had told him anything, because nobody had thought to. And George was decent and trusted his neighbors, and had said everything that was true, that Daniel was a good man, quiet since his wife passed, that he hadn't known Daniel was seeing anyone, that the marriage had surprised him. The woman who ran the Methodist church office had said he was devoted to that girl of his, had said she hoped whoever he married understood what she was getting, had said he wasn't a man who did anything halfway. Neither quote was hostile. Both of them together said, this came out of nowhere. And out of nowhere was exactly the story Brian needed. Daniel came in from the workshop at 7:15. He had been out there since 5:30, which Sandra had learned was what he did when he had something to think through and didn't want to think through it, lying in the dark. The workshop was where his hands went when his mind needed to work, without the pressure of results. He came through the interior door with sawdust on his forearms and a coffee mug that was already half empty, and looked at Sandra at the table and at her phone face up beside the mug and at the specific quality of her stillness, and he didn't ask what happened. He just came and read over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke while they were reading. Then he said, Bill didn't know we needed him on the same page, because nobody told him. That's on me. Sandra set the phone down. Media containment is my area. I should have. We both missed it. He pulled out the chair across from her. Sat. What does your PR director say? 3 missed calls from her. She wants a statement. Something that confirms the relationship is genuine. Sandra looked at the coffee she hadn't actually drunk yet. She wants personal details. Specific ones. The kind that can't be manufactured. They don't need to be manufactured. He said it without drama. Just noted it. The fact that your grandmother's program brought my grandfather here in 1987. That's documented. That's in the archive records you found. That's not a planted story. That's a real thread that existed before any of this. She looked at him. Or the clock trick, he said. Blank look. I'll explain later. He drank his coffee. The point is, you don't need to manufacture warmth when warmth is actually present. Tell your PR director the real version. The grandfather connection. Start there. Let the rest grow from it. A pause. Is it present? She held his gaze across the table. Yes, she said quietly. And then tell her that. Sandra called her PR director at 7:30. Told her the grandfather story, the archive records, the foundation connection that had existed since 1987, without either of them knowing the other existed. The conversation in the workshop where Dorothy's name had come up and something in Sandra's chest had shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her PR director listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual because her PR director interrupted everything. And when Sandra finished, there was a silence that lasted 4 full seconds. Sandra, carefully, is this actually real? Yes. How real? More than I planned for. She looked at the kitchen window, the backyard, the fence line. I don't know what to do with it yet. But yes. Her PR director exhaled long. The sound of someone who has been doing crisis communications for 20 years encountering something that is not in fact a crisis. Okay. I can work with actually real. Genuinely, that's the best thing you could have told me. The statement went out at 9. It led with the grandfather connection, moved to the foundation's documented work with local craftsmen throughout Georgia's coastal counties, and ended with a single quote from Sandra that her PR director had written, and Sandra had read once and approved without editing, which was the first time in 4 years that had happened. The quote said, "Some connections are older than the people who finally find them." George Patton called Daniel directly at 9:45 to apologize. "I didn't know," George said, genuinely stricken. "I was just talking. I didn't know anybody was writing it down. You didn't do anything wrong." Daniel had stepped outside to take the call, standing on the gravel in the morning heat. "You told the truth." "That's exactly right. I should have asked who she was before I—"
You're kind.
The voice of a man who does not blame people for operating in good faith. "You're fine, thank you for calling." He came back inside. Sandra was at the kitchen table with her laptop now, the PR response drafted and sent, 3 follow-up emails in progress, the particular focused efficiency of someone whose native mode is forward motion. She had changed clothes, navy, again, but different this one, less formal, the blazer gone, sleeves to the elbow. Her hair was still pulled back, but looser than it had been at the courthouse. She looked like someone who had been living in this house for more than 36 hours. Amy appeared at 10 with her laptop and a bowl of cereal and established herself at the far end of the table with the comfortable authority of someone who has decided the table is large enough for multiple operations. She did not ask about the article. She had presumably read it. She simply sat down and opened her laptop and began working, and occasionally looked up to observe the dynamics at the table's other end with the quiet attentiveness she applied to most things. The first real crisis came on Wednesday, not from a journalist, not from Brian's network, from the Foundation's operating accounts, which Sandra checked every morning, with the specific vigilance of someone who has learned that financial shifts are always the earliest signal. A $3 million grant partnership, in the final stage of execution. A regional arts and cultural preservation consortium out of Charleston that had been in discussion with the Foundation for 8 months and had been 48 hours from signing. The consortium's executive director sent a single email at 8 in the morning. Professional, regretful, citing concerns about organizational stability in light of recent media coverage and their board's preference for established institutional relationships during periods of leadership transition. 2 sentences. 15 years of relationship building dissolved in 2 sentences, because Brian had made calls. Sandra had no proof. Not yet. But she understood how this worked the way she understood the load-bearing elements of any structure she'd had to navigate. Some things don't require documentation to be understood completely. She found Daniel in the workshop at 8:15 and stood in the doorway and didn't say anything immediately, and he looked at her and set down the plane he was running along a board edge and waited, because that was what he did. He waited, without fidgeting, without filling the space, without performing patience. Just gave her the room to arrive wherever she was going at the pace that was honest. $3 million, she said. A consortium partnership. Withdrawn this morning. He was quiet for a moment. Brian. Almost certainly. I can't prove it yet. But you know. I know. She sat down on the stool near the workbench, not the way she would have sat in a boardroom or at her own desk. Just sat. Like a person who needs to sit for a minute. Like someone for whom the chair is simply the nearest available thing and not a statement about position. Daniel noticed this. He would not have been able to explain why it mattered. But it mattered. 3 million is real, he said. That's not a warning shot. No. She looked at her hands. That's the message. What does it mean for operations? In the short term, it means we restructure the Q3 grant cycle. Push one site assessment to Q1 next year. It's manageable. But it's also real damage to real work. A pause. 2 of the properties in that consortium's coverage zone haven't had a full assessment in 4 years. That timeline just got longer. Daniel looked at the board he'd been working, ran his thumb along the grain. He wanted you to feel it, he said. Not just strategically, personally. He knows you care about the actual properties. Yes. So he hit the properties. Yes. The word landed quietly between them. And because Daniel Cole did not offer hollow reassurance, and did not pretend that things were fine when they demonstrably were not, he simply sat with it for a moment. Let the damage be real. Let her sit in the reality of it, without rushing her toward the recovery plan, which she was already developing whether she was conscious of it or not, because that was also who Sandra Whitfield was. Okay, he said finally. What do you need to do today? She looked up. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the specific sensation of being asked the right question by the right person at the right moment. I need to call the consortium's executive director. Personally. And I need to talk to 2 board members before Brian does. Then do that. He picked up the plane. Amy's working at the table if you need the kitchen. Workshop door stays open. She stood, looked at him for a moment. This man in sawdust and early morning light, asking her what she needed with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who assumes she knows what she needs and just requires the space to pursue it. Thank you, she said, Go make your calls, he said. I've got work to finish. She made the calls. The conversation with the consortium's executive director lasted 42 minutes. Sandra did not attempt to reverse the decision. She acknowledged the concern, asked specific questions about what reassurances would change their board's assessment, listened to the answers carefully and took notes, and promised a follow-up call in 3 weeks with specific documentation addressing each point raised. Professional. Measured. The director ended the call more warmly than she had begun it, which was the best available outcome, and Sandra knew it. The 2 board calls were different. Both were Eleanor's original appointees. Barbara Langston, 81, who had been with the foundation since the beginning and whose voice on the phone had the particular steadiness of someone who has been through enough not to be rattled by something as ordinary as a hostile cousin and a dropped grant. And James Whitmore, 73, the foundation's longtime attorney before Thomas Mercer, who still held a board seat and whose primary value in moments like this was that Brian had never once in 30 years managed to make him uncertain about anything. Both calls were short. Both said the same thing without saying it directly. We are watching and we are with you and we trust you to handle this. It was enough. What happened on Thursday was not Brian's doing. At least not directly. At least not in any way Sandra could prove. But Brian had seeded the ground, and someone else had decided to plant something in it. And the result was a story in a publication that Sandra's PR director described as small, targeted, and specifically designed for people who wanted plausible deniability about where they got their information. Photographs, long lens, taken from across the street at a distance that kept them technically legal and practically damaging. Daniel leaving a building in downtown Savannah with a woman, the angle chosen with care, the caption raising questions it did not answer, the text structured around the phrase according to sources close to the situation. And what does this marriage actually mean, and is Sandra Whitfield getting exactly what she paid for? Sandra saw it at 6 a.m. Read it twice. Set her phone face down on the bathroom counter. Stood looking at the mirror for approximately 30 seconds. And then did something she did not fully understand until she was already doing it. She did not go immediately to Daniel. She sat with the information first. Alone. And she noticed, sitting with it, that her first response was not suspicion. Her first response was something closer to the specific anger you feel when someone tries to make you doubt something you actually know. She knew that building. She recognized the corner. Thomas Mercer's office was on the 4th floor of the Whitaker building, and she had seen it on the building directory when she had visited Thomas 3 weeks ago to finalize the grant restructuring paperwork. And the woman in the photograph, who was blurred at that distance but visible enough, had hair that was entirely silver and a posture that said she was in her late 50s or older. Sandra had her assistant run the cross-reference before 6:30. 3 minutes later, Linda Bauer, Daniel's accountant of 6 years, 48 years old but silver-haired early, wife of Tom Bauer, who had done the custom cabinetry in the Methodist church lobby and who had known the Cole family for a decade. So she already knew. She already knew, and she went to find Daniel anyway. He was in the kitchen at 6:45 with his coffee and the newspaper he read in physical form on the mornings he had time, which said something about him that she hadn't needed to be told, but had noted regardless. He looked up when she came in and she handed him her phone and watched his face while he read. Surprise. Genuine. The expression of a man walking into a room he did not know existed. Not calculation. Not the quick reassembly of someone caught in something. Just honest surprise, and then, following immediately, the specific quality of confusion that belongs to someone who cannot locate the event being described in their actual memory. That's Linda Bauer. Flat. Just the fact. She's been my accountant for 6 years. She was there because I needed to finalize the paperwork on Amy's education trust. First installment from the foundation grant. He set the phone down. The woman's been married to Tom for 22 years. Tom did the bookshelves in the church lobby. My daughter was at their Christmas party last year, I know. Sandra said it before he could continue. He stopped. Looked at her. You knew before you showed me the article. My assistant ran the building address and cross-referenced the woman's description against your professional contacts at 6:28 this morning. She held his gaze. Yes. Something moved across his face. A slow sequence. Not offense. Something more complicated than offense. The expression of a man who has been evaluated and does not know whether to find it reassuring or invasive and is making peace in real time with the fact that it might be both. You investigated me, he said. I protected us. A pause, one beat. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then slowly the corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. Something quieter. The specific expression of a man who has been given a response that is exactly correct and knows it. You're getting better at that. At what? Knowing the difference. Something in her chest did something she didn't have a word for. She picked up her phone. My PR team is issuing a correction by 9. Full documentation of the building. Linda Bauer's professional relationship with you. The accountant's office letterhead. Verifiable. Boring. Done. Okay. Brian is running out of moves. Which means drank his coffee. What's the biggest thing he has left? Sandra was quiet for a moment. Longer than she usually allowed silence to sit. The prenuptial agreement, she said. Or the lack of one. He's going to argue that no financially sophisticated woman enters a marriage without one, unless the timeline was too compressed to be legitimate. Is that true? We were at the courthouse 13 hours after I knocked on your door. She sat down. We didn't have a prenuptial agreement. We had a separate legal contract signed before the marriage that specified the financial terms of the arrangement. Brian will argue that contract proves the marriage was commercial. So we restructure it. He said it like the answer had been available the whole time and he'd simply arrived at it. Call Thomas Mercer. The $2 million we agreed on, I want to convert it. Not to a personal payment, to a formal foundation grant for restoration work. Specific properties. I provide the labor. The foundation covers materials and logistics. Everything goes back into the work. She stared at him. You'd give up the $2 million. Amy's trust is already funded with the first installment. Even. Certain. She doesn't need more than that. And I don't need Brian's lawyers turning the rest of it into the story. He looked at her directly. The foundation needs restoration work. I do restoration work. That's not complicated. Sandra looked at this man across her kitchen table. This man who had just walked away from a sum of money that most people didn't see in a decade because the shape of it was wrong. Not because he was performing nobility. Not for the cameras or the board or the 14 months of scrutiny ahead. Because the shape was wrong, and he understood shapes the way other people understood arguments. And he was not willing to build anything on a foundation he didn't trust. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Thinking 3 moves ahead while I'm still on the current one. I learned it from you. He stood. Call Mercer. I've got a delivery at 10. She called Thomas Mercer at 7:15. The letter of intent for the restructured grant was drafted by noon. Not filed yet. Grant committee protocol required a quarterly meeting, but drafted, dated, and on record. Enough to remove the financial payment argument from Brian's toolkit before the next board review. Done by noon. And then Thursday afternoon arrived, and Amy came home for the weekend. And the thing that cracked the next situation open was not Brian, and was not a journalist, and was not a legal filing. It was Kayla Simmons, Amy's roommate at the university, whose mother apparently had strong opinions about things she had read on the internet. Amy dropped her bag in the hallway at 4:15, kissed her father on the cheek in passing the way she always did, and then stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked at Sandra working at the table and said, without preamble, Kayla's mom told her you and Dad got married for money. Sandra closed her laptop. Amy leaned against the doorframe. Not aggressive. Not performing confrontation. Just delivering information and watching to see what Sandra did with it. The way she watched. Most things. With the full, unhurried attention of someone who believes the evidence will tell her what she needs to know if she gives it sufficient time. What do you think? Sandra said. Amy considered the question seriously. The way she considered everything. I think Kayla's mom read the headline and not the article, she said slowly. I think people who actually live here see something different from people who are reading about it from outside. She looked at Sandra directly. You sit in the right chair. You've sat in the left chair every single morning since you got here. You didn't do it by accident, you remembered. Sandra held the gaze. That matters, Amy said. People don't remember things like that if they don't care about the people the things matter to. She picked up her bag from the floor. Besides, my dad doesn't do anything halfway. If he agreed to this, there's a reason. And the reason isn't money, because if it were money, he would have found a way to do it that didn't involve a strange woman sleeping in our guest room. She headed for the hallway. Tell Kayla's mom what you like. The people in this house know what's actually happening. She disappeared around the corner. Sandra sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a full minute. Not because she was stunned, because she was absorbing something that had been said with more clarity and more accuracy than anything she had heard in weeks of legal maneuvering and strategic communication and carefully crafted public statements. A 19-year-old who watched where people sat at the breakfast table, who measured sincerity in the small, unrehearsed details, who had applied the same rigor to Sandra that she applied to her assigned reading, and had arrived at a conclusion she was prepared to defend. When Daniel came in at 5:30, he looked at Sandra at the table and the closed laptop and the cold cup of tea she hadn't touched, and he looked at her the way he looked at the workshop when something had changed while he wasn't watching, locating the difference without needing to be told where it was. What happened? He said. She told him. Kayla's mother. The convenience marriage theory. Amy's response, which she relayed as accurately as she could, including the detail about the chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she's right. About people not getting that mad when they don't care. I know. Are you okay? She looked at her cold tea. I've been sitting here for an hour, she said, trying to figure out when this stopped being something I was managing and became something I was. She stopped. Living, he said. She looked up. That's okay, he said, not with the brightness of someone offering comfort, with the steadiness of someone stating a fact. That's the whole point. That's what we were trying to build, is it? And it wasn't rhetorical. It was a real question from a woman who had spent 8 months with real questions and very few real answers. Because what I'm feeling is, she stopped again. Tell me. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had known for 3 weeks. This man she had driven 4 hours to find after an algorithm had thrown up his grandfather's name in a 1987 archive. This man who made coffee too strong and read paper books and drove her to board meetings and waited in parking lots and gave up $2 million with the calm of someone returning a library book. I think, she said carefully, that I'm in serious trouble. The silence that followed was the fullest one she'd ever sat inside. Full of everything neither of them had named yet. Everything that had been growing in the space between the contract and whatever this was now. The arrangement and the choice. The plan and the thing that wasn't. Yeah, he said softly. Me too. The silence continued, and neither of them ended it because some things are better left full. Amy appeared in the kitchen doorway in her university sweatshirt with her laptop. Are we doing dinner or not? Because I've been working for 3 hours and I've earned it. She looked between them, registered the atmosphere, did not comment on it. I'm making the one with the sausage and the white beans because I've been thinking about it since Tuesday and I'm done waiting. Sandra looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Sandra. Something passed between them. Not planned. Not managed. The particular wordless warmth of two people sharing a moment that involves a third person they have both, in their different ways, decided matters. We need the big pot, Daniel said. I know where it is, Amy said and opened the cabinet. The next 2 weeks built their own structure, not because anyone planned a structure, because this was what happened when people occupied a space together long enough. The days developed edges, distinctions, the morning coffee at 5:47 and the newspaper. Sandra at the kitchen table by 7 with her laptop. Amy in the chair by the front window before she drove back to campus, 5 minutes exactly. Looking at the street the way she always looked at it. Doing nothing, just looking. The workshop going quiet at 9 every evening when Daniel came in. These were the bones of the place. Sandra was learning them, the way you learned a new language, not through study but through repetition and proximity, and the gradual accumulation of moments in which the words started to arrive before you consciously reached for them. She had stopped checking her phone during dinner on day 9. She had noticed this on day 11. She had been 2 bites into a Wednesday pasta when she realized she had been at the table for 40 minutes and her phone had been in her pocket the entire time, and she had not once thought to look at it. She had sat with this recognition for a moment, which was an unusual way to sit with anything for Sandra Whitfield, and then she had picked up her fork and continued eating. and decided that the recognition did not require an immediate response. It was on day 14 that Brian Whitfield sent his first investigator. The investigator was good, which was expected. Brian didn't hire people who weren't. He arrived in Savannah presenting as a journalist, researching a feature on traditional craft businesses in the coastal South, which was a real publication, a real pitch, and a real enough premise that George Patton at the hardware store talked to him for 25 minutes. Not about Sandra, about Daniel, about the quality of the work and the type of commissions and the community relationships and the timeline of the workshop's reputation. Standard background, innocuous in isolation. And then the same man appeared on the university campus email directory, doing outreach to students with local connections for a follow-up piece on the relationship between traditional craftsmanship and the next generation. Amy received the email at 8:17 on a Thursday morning. She forwarded it to Daniel at 8:19 with a single line, "This doesn't feel right." Daniel read it in the workshop. Read it once. Understood everything about it, in the way that people who have been paying attention to a threat understand its new configurations. He called Sandra at 8:22. Brian sent someone to Amy's school. His voice was level, not raised, not accelerated. The specific flat calm of a man who has decided the situation clearly and is communicating that decision. Email through the university direct. She didn't respond. She forwarded it to me immediately. The temperature in Sandra's voice dropped in a way that was not cold exactly, but was something adjacent to cold. Something measured and precise and pointing in a very particular direction. "Is she okay?" "She's fine, she's in class. I'm going to need you to understand that this crossed a line." Her voice was very quiet. "Whatever the legal arrangement is, whatever Brian thinks he's doing. Amy doesn't get used as a research instrument, I know." "Daniel, I know," she said. And there was something in it that was not just legal awareness, not just strategic recognition, something that lived closer to the chest. The specific anger of a woman who has been in this house for 2 weeks and has watched this man drive his daughter to the airport and read her texts when she sends them and know by the quality of her pauses when something is wrong before she says a word, and who has, somewhere in those 2 weeks, begun to understand why all of it matters with a directness that no longer requires the framework of the arrangement to justify it. "I'm calling Thomas Mercer in the next 5 minutes. Any further contact with individuals connected to this household, particularly Amy, gives us grounds for a witness intimidation motion that shuts Brian's will contest down entirely." Victoria, and then he caught himself. "Sandra." She noticed the near slip and said nothing about it. "Do what you need to do," he said. "I trust you." She made the calls. Thomas Mercer, then her own attorney. Then, because the situation called for it, and because she had decided in the first 30 seconds of that phone conversation that the legal route was necessary but not sufficient, she called Brian directly. No intermediary, no assistant placing the call. She dialed the number herself at 8:45, and when he answered, she did not say hello, and she did not allow the opening she could hear him arranging. "You sent someone to Amy's university using a journalism cover to get eyes on a 19-year-old who has nothing to do with any legal filing connected to this situation." Her voice was even. The evenness of someone who has achieved quiet not through effort but through certainty. "You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to remove that person from any further contact with anyone connected to this house or this family. After that, Thomas Mercer files a motion for witness intimidation. I take that motion to every journalist who has covered this story, and then I am done being measured about this." Brian's voice, when it came, was measured in the opposite way. The measure of someone who has been caught doing something they thought was subtle. "You're threatening me. I'm telling you what happens next. In sequence. You can call it whatever you want." She didn't give him the second beat he was opening his mouth to take. 9 o'clock. She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this, not because she expected them to be, because she had expected to feel the particular cold of someone executing a tactical decision, and what she felt instead was something warmer, something that had Amy's name threaded through it in a way she was not going to examine in the parking lot of the Whitfield Foundation's Savannah office at 8:46 in the morning. Later. She would examine it later. Brian pulled the investigator by noon. Thomas Mercer filed the formal warning letter by 2. not the full motion. They held that back, because a motion filed gives you less leverage than a motion threatened, and Sandra understood leverage, and the letter was specific enough that Brian's attorneys called Thomas's office at 4 to discuss parameters. Sandra told Daniel all of this at dinner. Amy was at the table. She listened without comment, eating the leftover white beans situation from the night before, and when Sandra finished the summary, Amy said, "Good," and reached for more bread. Daniel looked at his daughter, then at Sandra, and something in his face did the thing it sometimes did, the thing Sandra had learned to look for, because it was the thing that was most honest, the slight opening of an expression that was usually closed. He looked like a man watching something he hadn't been certain he could count on prove itself countable. The correction piece went out that afternoon. Documentation of the building address, Linda Bauer's professional relationship and credentials and 16-year marriage, the accountant's office contact information for any journalist who wanted to verify. Sandra's PR director described it as the cleanest kill she'd ever executed. Sandra thought about the word kill and decided it was accurate. Brian did not respond publicly. He wouldn't. Not yet. Because Brian Whitfield was not a man who made public statements when he was losing positions. He was a man who changed tactics. And Sandra had been watching him change tactics for 8 months, and she knew what the escalation looked like when it came. It looked like a call you didn't expect, from a number you hadn't saved, at a time that was designed to catch you unprepared. What she didn't know was that the call wouldn't come to her. That Saturday evening, Barbara Langston called the house line. Not Sandra's phone. The house line. The number that was listed in the county directory under D. Cole. Daniel answered it at 5:47, because he was in the kitchen at 5:47 the way he was in the kitchen at 5:47 every morning, and because a call to the house line at that hour on a Saturday was the kind of thing that required answering. Is this Daniel Cole? The voice was 81 years old and had the particular steadiness of someone who has outlasted every storm they've walked into and has stopped being surprised by weather. It is. Good. My name is Barbara Langston. I've been with the Whitfield Foundation since 1984. I knew Dorothy Whitfield for 40 years. A pause. I wanted to speak with you before I spoke with Sandra. I hope that's not presumptuous. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. Tell me what you need to tell me. Barbara Langston had watched Dorothy build the foundation from a $60,000 passion project into a $400 million institution. She had watched Dorothy age and plan and worry and, in the last 2 years of her life, write and rewrite her estate planning, with the specific careful attention of a woman who understood that the structure of what she left behind mattered as much as the content. Dorothy worried about Sandra, Barbara said. Not about her competence. That was never the question. About her rootedness. Whether she had people. Whether she had a life that was actually hers, as distinct from a function of her responsibilities. A pause that had weight in it. Eleanor put that marriage clause in her will deliberately, Daniel. Not to control her granddaughter. To force her to stop long enough to let someone in. Daniel was very still. She engineered it. She created conditions. Precise correction. She couldn't choose who. She couldn't choreograph how. But she knew Sandra well enough to know that without a deadline, without something genuinely inescapable, her granddaughter would spend the rest of her life preparing to live instead of living. Another pause. Dorothy used to say that the kindest thing you could give someone who was very capable was a situation their capability couldn't solve alone. He absorbed this. Does Sandra know? Sandra knows her grandmother loved her. I'm not certain she's understood yet that love sometimes looks like a chess move. Barbara's voice was dry. Not unkind. The dryness of someone reporting a true thing without dressing it up. I'm telling you, because I believe you're the right person to understand it, and because I think you'll know when the moment is right to tell her, or whether to tell her at all. Why do you trust me with that? Because you answered the phone. Simple. Unapologetic. At 5:47 on a Saturday evening. In your own kitchen, which means you're actually there. And because when I said Dorothy's name just now, I heard something in your silence that told me you understand what she built and why it mattered. The pause that followed belonged to both of them. Take care of her, Barbara said. Not because she needs managing. Because she's finally stopped managing herself long enough to be cared for. She hung up. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the phone in his hand and thought about a woman he had never met who had kept sand dollars on her desk from a South Carolina beach for 40 years, who had made tomato soup with butter and cream for foundation volunteers and meant it as something more than hospitality, who had, with the extraordinary patience of someone who loved a specific person completely and was willing to play a long game on their behalf, constructed a legal deadline in her own will and placed it precisely where her granddaughter would not be able to think her way around it. He thought, "You knew, didn't you?" And then he thought, "Thank you." Sandra came in from the back porch at 6:15. Hair loose, which was the version of herself she was only before the day made its demands. She looked at him at the table with the phone beside his coffee, and something in her face asked the question before she did. "Who called?" she said. He looked at her. This woman who had driven 4 hours to his workshop in silk and precision and controlled desperation, who had learned to sit in the right chair, who had called Brian Whitfield directly because someone had tried to involve Amy and had not once, in 2 weeks, treated that as anything other than a line that did not move. Not yet. The moment wasn't this one. She was standing in the doorway in the last of the evening light, and the answer he was holding needed more than a kitchen doorway. It needed the moment when everything else had quieted, when the legal architecture had done what it was going to do and what remained was only the real thing, unenclosed. "Barbara Langston," he said. She wanted to talk about Dorothy. Sandra's eyes moved across his face the way they moved when she was reading him, looking for the grain. What did she say? He held her gaze, gave her the shape of it. She said, "She's glad you're not doing this alone anymore." Sandra stood with that for a moment. She was choosing to accept the partial answer. He could see her choosing it. And the choosing itself was something he hadn't known. He was waiting to see Sandra Whitfield leaving a thread unpulled, because she had decided to trust the person holding the other end. "Okay," she said quietly. She poured her coffee, sat down at the left chair. Outside, the evening settled over Savannah the way it always did, without announcement, unhurried, like a thing that had been happening for a long time and intended to keep happening. Tomorrow, Brian would make his final move. Neither of them knew that yet. For now, there was coffee and the left chair, and the workshop gone quiet, and the particular quality of a Saturday evening. In a house where two people have stopped pretending, the only thing keeping them in the same room is a legal document, which was, Daniel thought, exactly the kind of thing that was worth sitting with for as long as it lasted. Which was also, he thought, the kind of thing that might last a while. He didn't say any of that out loud. Some things were better received in the fullness of their own time. He reached for his coffee. She was already reaching for hers. Their hands didn't touch, but they were reaching in the same direction. And in a house like this one, in an evening like this one, that was enough to be going on with. The board meeting was on a Thursday. Daniel drove her. She hadn't asked him to. The night before, he'd said it the way he said most things that were already decided. "I'll drive you tomorrow." Not offered, not suggested, just stated, the shape of a fact. And Sandra had started to say something about independence, about not needing, and then she'd looked at him and he'd looked at her with that particular patience. That was not the same thing as waiting. And she'd said okay, and that had been the end of it. 40 minutes to Atlanta. Mostly quiet. The kind of quiet that had developed its own texture over the past weeks, that was no longer the quiet of two people being careful around each other, but the quiet of two people who had said enough that silence had become another form of saying something. 15 minutes out, she told him the room. 7 board members. Barbara Langston and James Whitmore, Dorothy's original appointments. 3 newer members, more corporate in orientation, harder to read. Philip Dalton, Brian's direct ally, whose smile arrived before his sincerity did and stayed longer than both. And Brian himself. "Which 2 are Dorothy's?" Daniel said. "Barbara and James. Barbara has been there since 1984. James was Dorothy's attorney for 30 years before Thomas Mercer. They'll be watching you." He kept his eyes on the highway. "Not the paperwork, you. The way you carry yourself when you talk about her." Sandra looked at the road ahead. She kept a jar of sand dollars on her desk, she said. "From a beach in South Carolina. First trip she and my grandfather took after their wedding. 3 days in a rented house with no telephone. A pause. She never moved it. Not through 3 office renovations. Not after he died. Not through 40 years of that foundation becoming something none of us fully predicted. Tell them that, he said. Lead with that. That's not a legal argument. No. He changed lanes. Easy. It's better than one. She looked at him. The building was glass and steel and 47 years old, which was a combination Atlanta managed without apparent irony. Daniel pulled into the parking structure and stopped the car and turned to face her. Not to give a speech, not to deliver the motivational moment she might have scripted if she were writing this scene herself. Just looked at her, the way he looked at things he was taking the actual measure of. You know what you're doing in there, he said. You've known this foundation longer than anyone in that room. You know what Dorothy believed. You know why it matters. A beat. Walk in like you already belong there. She recognized the language, felt it land differently now than when she'd said it to Amy over a bowl of cereal 6 weeks ago. Because Amy had walked across the kitchen with the precise gravity of a young woman who had been given a tool and intended to use it. And Sandra understood, standing here, that she had been given the same tool and had been using it badly for 8 months. Walking into rooms like someone who needed to prove she belonged instead of someone who simply did. Clock trick, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Clock trick. She got out. He didn't drive away. She didn't look back to confirm this. She knew it the way she'd started knowing certain things about Daniel Cole, not through evidence, but through the accumulated weight of a man who did what he said and said what he meant, and had not once in 6 weeks given her a reason to recalibrate that assessment. He was there. He would be there when she came back. That was simply how he operated. She walked into the building like she owned it. Because she did. Brian was already in the room when she entered, standing near the window with a coffee cup and the posture of a man who has arranged the furniture in his imagination, and arrived early to make sure nobody moved it. He looked at her when she walked in and his expression did something layered and involuntary. Surprise underneath. Then contempt over it. Then below both of those, something she recognized after a moment as genuine uncertainty. He had not expected her to look like this. Settled. Clear. Unhurried. Like someone who had stopped running. Sandra, he said. Brian. She moved to her chair, placed her hands flat on the table the way she'd placed them at the courthouse 6 weeks ago. Then she looked at the room. Dalton with his practiced warmth. James Whitmore with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. The 3 newer members arranged like questions waiting to be answered. Barbara Langston, 81 years old. White-haired, with the eyes of someone who has watched decades of human decision-making and has developed very specific opinions about which kind survives. Barbara looked at Sandra for a long moment. Then she said, "Sit down, dear. Let's get this done." Sandra sat. She looked around the table one more time, and then she spoke. "Before we go to procedure," she said, "I want to tell you something about my grandmother." She let the pause land. She kept a jar of sand dollars on her desk. From a beach in South Carolina. A rental house with no telephone, first trip after her wedding. She and my grandfather spent 3 days there. She brought the sand dollars home in a paper bag. Another pause. She never moved that jar. Not through renovations. Not through loss. Not through 40 years of this foundation changing in ways none of us predicted. She kept it because she believed that what you build should be rooted in something real. Not in paperwork. Not in legal clauses. She let her eyes move around the table. In people. In love. In the work of showing up. The room was very quiet. Barbara's eyes were bright. Not with sadness. With something that recognized itself in being named. Brian set his coffee cup down. The sound was too loud in the silence. Deliberate. A reclaiming of the room's attention. "That's very moving," he said. "But this is a governance meeting, not a eulogy. The clause is satisfied." James Whitmore's voice was dry and precise. He slid a document across the table without ceremony. Marriage certificate. Filed with the Chatham County Clerk's office. Legally executed. Properly witnessed. He looked at Brian over his glasses with the expression of a man who has read every version of every document in this room and has strong opinions about people who have not. The condition of the will has been met. Brian looked at the certificate. His jaw worked. "I'll be contesting the circumstances." "On what grounds?" Whitmore said. "On the grounds that this marriage is..." He stopped. Weighed something. Convenient. Convenience is not a legal standard, Brian. Authenticity is. He looked directly at Sandra. I intend to spend the next 14 months demonstrating that this is a fabricated arrangement entered into for financial benefit, and that the spirit of Dorothy's condition has not been satisfied. He let the smile arrive, controlled. I have resources. I have time. And I have a very clear memory of how many times in the last 8 months you've tried to manage a situation that was fundamentally unmanageable. The room held its breath. Sandra looked at her cousin. She thought about Daniel in the parking structure below, about Amy at a Saturday morning table asking real questions about a cat named Gerald, about Barbara Langston's voice on the phone telling Daniel that Dorothy had loved her granddaughter well enough to construct a trap made of genuine care, about a jar of sand dollars that had survived 3 office renovations and 40 years and 1 death and was still on a desk somewhere, still holding the weight of a morning on a South Carolina beach when 2 people had just started. Go ahead, she said. Calm. Absolute. The calm of someone who has located solid ground and is no longer afraid of the person trying to convince her it isn't there. Spend the next 14 months watching us. Send your people. Review every document. Interview every neighbor. She held his gaze. What you'll find is a man who shows up every single day without being asked, without performance, without strategy, because that is simply who he is. She paused. You've spent your whole career in rooms like this one, Brian. You know how to read the manufactured version of everything. But I don't think you know what the real thing looks like anymore. I think you've spent so long working the system that you've forgotten the system was built to protect something actual. Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it. Not defeat. Not rage. Something older. The expression of a man who has been told a true thing he did not want to receive and knows, somewhere below the strategy, that it landed. Barbara Langston cleared her throat. I moved to confirm Sandra Whitfield as director of the Whitfield Foundation in full satisfaction of the conditions set forth in Dorothy Whitfield's will, she said. Her voice was 70 years of knowing exactly what she wanted to say and saying it. Do I have a second? Seconded. James Whitmore, without hesitation. The vote was 5-2. Dalton and Brian against. Everyone else for. Done. Sandra sat in the room while people gathered folders and exchanged murmurs, and the ordinary business of a meeting's end moved around her. She did not perform relief. She did not arrange her face into the expression of victory, because what she felt was not victory. Victory was something you achieved at the end of a contest. What she felt was different. Quieter. The specific sensation of a door closing on a hallway that had been very long, and the sudden awareness that the room you were standing in now was the one that had always been waiting. She had been fighting to get here for 8 months, and she had spent almost none of those 8 months thinking about what here actually meant. She went outside. The Atlanta morning had turned warm, and the parking structure was shadowed, and she crossed it toward the truck, and Daniel was leaning against the driver's side door with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, which was what he looked like when he was thinking, without trying to arrive at anything specific. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and his expression asked the question without asking it. 5-2, she said. He nodded once. Small. The nod of someone receiving information they had already half expected and are confirming, not celebrating. You okay? She considered lying. The automatic reflex. The composed CEO with the press release already drafted in her head and the next agenda item already queued. She could feel the reflex. And she also felt, standing in this parking structure on a Thursday morning in Atlanta, the specific tiredness of a woman who has been performing fine for a very long time, and has recently discovered that the people in her actual life are not fooled by it. Brian said he's going to spend 14 months proving we're not real. She watched Daniel's face. He said it in front of the whole board. I know. That doesn't concern you. He pushed off the truck, opened the passenger door. The gesture of a man who has already answered the question in his own mind and is moving to the next thing. Get in, he said. Amy has a study session this afternoon, and she texted me this morning asking if you'd be back in time to help her prep. She said, and I'm quoting directly, that you explained compound interest better than her professor did and she needs the follow-up. Sandra looked at him. 14 months of scrutiny, she said. Everything examined. Every moment. That's what's coming. He looked at her steadily across the open door. The morning light was doing something specific to the angle of his face. The way morning light sometimes did things that you noticed without meaning to notice them. Only if there's nothing real to find, he said. Is there? She thought about 6 weeks. Pasta and the wrong amount of garlic. A jar of sand dollars she'd described in a boardroom and watched land in Barbara Langston's eyes like recognition. A chair at the end of a table that nobody sat in. A 19-year-old who read every assigned book because she'd promised herself she would. Coffee at 5:47. A man who drove to board meetings and waited in parking lots because that was simply what he did. A ring that cost $47 and weighed more than anything she'd purchased in the past decade. Yes, she said. There is. Then we've got nothing to worry about. He waited. Patient. The specific patience that had never felt like waiting, but it always felt like presence. Come on. Amy's going to want to hear about the vote. She got in the truck. He closed the door. And for the third time in 6 weeks, Sandra Whitfield felt something she had stopped expecting to feel. Something that was not managed. Not strategic. Not the product of a plan or a deadline or a 40-year chess move played from beyond the grave by a woman who had loved her granddaughter enough to construct a trap made entirely of care. Just ground. Solid, actual, reliable ground. Beneath her feet. Without conditions. Brian Whitfield made his final move on a Monday. Not through lawyers. Not through another planted article or another investigator with a journalism cover. He made it the way people make their last moves, when they have exhausted the professional options and have decided that personal damage is the only currency they have left. He called Daniel directly. Daniel was in the workshop. 10 in the morning. The light through the 2 windows was the specific autumn light that had started replacing the summer light sometime in the past week. Cooler and more angled, the kind that made the grain of the wood show differently. He answered because Amy had a midterm, and he answered unknown numbers on days when Amy had midterms. Mr. Cole. Brian's voice was smooth in the way it was always smooth. The smoothness of someone who practices the performance of ease. I think it's time we had a conversation without my cousin in the room. Daniel set down the chisel he'd been working with. How did you get this number? I'm thorough. You know that about me by now. What do you want, Brian? Not a question. A door held open the minimum possible width. What Brian wanted was $5 million. He explained it, with the particular precision of someone who has rehearsed the offer enough times to have removed all the phrasing that might sound like what it actually was. $5 million wired to any account Daniel chose, before end of business, in exchange for a signed affidavit confirming that the marriage had been entered into as a commercial arrangement with no genuine romantic or familial intent. Clean. Simple. Everyone walks away with what they actually came for. You're a working man, Brian said. A father. You made a practical decision when a compelling offer was placed in front of you. There's no shame in that. But you have to know this arrangement has an expiration date. When it ends, you go back to your workshop and your daughter and your life. And Sandra goes back to her world. A pause precisely calibrated, and those 2 worlds don't actually intersect. Not permanently. Not really. You know that. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Brian filled the silence the way skilled manipulators fill silences, with the sound of reasonableness. $5 million, Mr. Cole. That's not an insult. That's your daughter's future. That's the kind of security that changes everything for a man in your position. Think about what that actually means. You done, Daniel said. A beat. I'm offering you $5 million, I heard you. His voice was level in the way a floor is level. Not performed, structural. You called me to buy my testimony against my wife. You used the word practical, like you were paying me a compliment. But what you meant is that you think I can be purchased because I work with my hands and I don't have a board seat. He picked the chisel back up. The weight of it was familiar and real. You're wrong about all of it, Mr. Cole. Don't call this number again. He hung up. He stood in the workshop for 60 seconds without moving. Not because he was shaken. Because he was giving himself the space to feel what he actually felt before he did the next thing, which was important because the next thing mattered. He called Sandra. She answered on the second ring. Brian just called me, he said. Offered $5 million for a signed affidavit confirming the marriage was commercial. I said no. You need to know because I'm not having conversations about this marriage without telling you. The The silence on her end lasted exactly 4 seconds. He called you directly. Her voice was controlled in the way that meant the opposite of calm underneath it. The control of someone applying significant pressure to something that wants to move in a different direction. On the house line. Yes. Are you okay? I'm fine. He set the chisel down again. Are you? I will be. A pause. In approximately the amount of time it takes Thomas Mercer to file a motion for attempted subornation of perjury from a principal in an active legal matter. Something in her voice went somewhere arctic, precise and cold and pointing in a very specific direction. He just handed us the mechanism to end this. Completely. Sandra. Yeah. $5 million. He said it flat. Just the number. Not to hurt her with it. Because it was real and real things deserve to be named. That's what he thinks my word is worth. That's the number he put on it. Her silence this time was different, longer. The silence of someone absorbing something that has landed not in the strategy part of the brain but somewhere less managed. Daniel, I'm not upset about it. I want you to know that. He looked at the grain of the board he'd been working. I want you to know I've thought about what my answer would have been at any point in the last 6 weeks. Every single day of the last 6 weeks. He paused. It was always no. Not because of the contract. The contract stopped being the reason a long time ago. I want you to know that. The silence that followed was the longest one she'd offered him. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. I know, she said. I've known that for a while. A breath. Go back to work. I'll call Mercer. Go make your calls, he said. She did. Thomas Mercer filed the motion at 4 p.m. By 6, Brian's attorney had called Thomas's office to discuss settlement parameters. By 8, Brian Whitfield, through counsel, because Brian Whitfield was not a man who made personal calls when he was losing, had formally and in writing withdrawn the will contest. It was over. Sandra read the settlement confirmation on her laptop at the kitchen table. Daniel made dinner. Amy was home for the weekend and sat across from Sandra with her own laptop and her own work, and the kitchen had the specific warm density of a weeknight in a house where people have been living together long enough that the evenings have their own weight. Amy looked up from her screen, looked at Sandra's face. Read whatever she found there. Done, she said. Done, good. Amy went back to her reading. Clean as that. Sandra looked at Daniel at the stove and felt the specific complicated fullness of a woman who had been fighting for 8 months and had just been handed the victory, and discovered that victory felt much quieter than she had expected. Not disappointing, just different. Like arriving somewhere you've been walking toward for a long time and finding that the place itself is smaller than the walking was. What she felt was not triumph. What she felt was the sensation of a door closing on a very long hallway, and the sudden clear awareness that the room she was standing in now was the one that actually mattered. The one with the garlic-heavy pasta and the 5:47 coffee, and the workshop going quiet at 9 and the chair at the end of the table that nobody sat in, which was its own kind of presence. Its own kind of love made visible in an absence that everyone in this house chose to honor every single day without discussing it. After dinner, after Amy had retreated to her room with a study podcast and a determination to finish her reading before 10, Daniel and Sandra sat at the kitchen table, with the settlement document closed on the laptop between them and the particular quiet of a Monday evening in October settling around the house. It's over, she said. Yes. She looked at the laptop, then at her hands, then at him. The 14 months don't matter anymore, she said. Legally, the contest is withdrawn. The foundation is secured. She held his gaze. You could end the marriage now. Quietly. The legal threat is gone. There's no reason. Sandra. She stopped. Are you asking what I want, he said, or are you telling me what I'm allowed to want? The question landed with the precise weight of something that had been waiting to be asked for 6 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. I'm asking what you want, I asked first. The corner of her mouth moved, almost. The closest thing to involuntary she'd allowed all evening. I made Eleanor's soup last week, she said. Amy asked me to teach her how to make it, Dorothy's version, with the butter and the cream. I've made it twice in my life, and I watched Dorothy make it 100 times, and apparently that was enough. She looked at her hands. Your father called last Tuesday. He wanted to apologize for how the first call went. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me the story about the time you built a bookshelf for your 8th grade English teacher. Because she didn't have enough shelf space, and you had figured out how to use a miter saw over the summer. She paused. I'm going to use that against you someday. Fair. I sit in the left chair, she said. I remember about Claire's chair every single morning when I walk into this kitchen. Every morning. Without fail. Without having to remind myself. Her voice was even, but her eyes were doing something that evenness couldn't contain. I think about the kind of love that makes a chair sacred. And I think about the kind of man who teaches his daughter to honor it without ever once making it a burden. She stopped. Gathered something. I am not going anywhere. That is not what I want. The kitchen was very quiet. What do you want? He said. Quiet. Serious. The question underneath the question. She held his gaze. I want to stop calling this an arrangement, she said. I want to stop counting months. I want to be here because I chose it. Not because Dorothy engineered it, and not because a legal document requires it, and not because I ran out of alternatives on a 4-hour drive to a stranger's workshop. She stopped, swallowed. I want what's actually in this house. The pasta and the workshop and the books with the broken spines and Amy's 5 minutes by the window before she drives back to school. She stopped again. I want you. That's what I want. I've been managing that sentence for 6 weeks and I'm done managing it. The room held whatever rooms hold when someone has finally said the true thing. Daniel looked at the woman across the table. This woman who had walked into his workshop in September with a legal document and a desperate deadline, and the absolute precision of someone who believed that sufficient preparation was a substitute for presence, who had learned to sit in the right chair, who had called Brian Whitfield at 8:45 in the morning, because someone had touched Amy and had not once in 6 weeks treated that line as negotiable, who had stood in a boardroom and told a true story about sand dollars and watched it do more work than 40 pages of legal argument, who had made Dorothy's soup and gotten it right on the second try and stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled up like someone who intended to keep doing this. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay, he said it. The same word. Exactly the same. No larger. No smaller. I want the same thing. I just needed to know you did. That's it. Her voice was halfway between disbelief and something warmer. Just okay. What did you want me to say? Something more. She searched for the word. Expansive. The corner of his mouth moved. For real this time. You walked into my workshop 4 months ago and proposed marriage with a legal contract and a 13-hour deadline, he said. I think we've both established that we don't require a lot of words to understand each other. She looked at him, and something broke open in her chest in the best possible way. Not the managed version. Not the version that had been organized and scheduled and placed at the appropriate moment in the appropriate sequence, the other kind. The kind that arrives before you can do anything about it. You are genuinely insufferable, she said. Amy says that, too. What does Amy say? She says I'm persistently literal. She looked it up specifically to use correctly. Sandra laughed. A real one. The kind that arrives before you can arrange your face. The kind that is pure release rather than performance. That sounds like something has finally been allowed to come out after holding its breath for a long time. And it filled the kitchen the way things fill rooms when they belong there. Daniel watched her laugh and felt the specific quiet happiness of a man who has waited longer than he expected to feel like himself again, and has found that the feeling, when it came, was not what he'd anticipated, not relief, not return. Something new, something that had required everything that came before it in order to exist. The knock on the doorframe was Amy's. She was in the hallway, in her oversized sweatshirt with her laptop under one arm, and the expression of someone who has completed an assessment and arrived at a conclusion. I finished the reading, she said, and I heard that. She pointed between them, accurate, unambiguous. I'm not going to make it weird. But for the record, she tilted her head. I called it on day 2. Day 2, Sandra said, when you didn't do the face. Amy looked at her father. I told you, Dad. Day 2. You told me, he said. I'm going to check on Mr. Patterson's cat. I promised I'd feed him while they're in Asheville. She stopped, turned back. Her face was doing the thing it sometimes did when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking, or just let it exist privately. She decided to say it. I'm glad you came back, she said to Sandra, simply, directly. The way she said everything. That first night when I asked if you were coming back. I already knew you were. I just wanted to hear you say it. She turned back toward the hall. Good night. The door to her room clicked shut. The house was very quiet. Sandra looked at the hallway, at the closed door, at the framed photograph on the wall beside it. A beach summer, Amy at about 12 with her father's eyes and sand on her feet, and the kind of smile that means you've forgotten there's a camera, and beside it, a space on the wall. Empty. Slightly different in color where something used to hang and had been taken down. She looked at that space for a moment, then at Daniel. What was there, she said. He looked at the empty space. Something in his face settled into a particular stillness, a drawing Amy made when she was 9. Few months after Claire passed, she drew the three of us and put it on the wall herself. Last year she took it down. She said it was time to make room. He paused. She didn't throw it away. It's in her room. Sandra held that. She's making room, she said. She is. The following Sunday, Amy came home with colored pencils and a large sheet of paper and the quiet, purposeful energy of someone who has decided to do a thing and intends to do it completely. She sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours on Sunday afternoon working while Daniel was in the workshop and Sandra was on the back porch, on a call, and when they both drifted back into the kitchen at 4, she was done. And she was satisfied in the specific way she was satisfied when she'd finished something that had come out the way she'd intended. It goes in the hallway, she said. I already decided. She held it up. 3 figures in colored pencil. One tall with dark hair. One in a blue dress, dark-haired. Precise in the way that Amy's drawings were always precise. The proportions honest rather than flattering. One with Amy's own posture. The easy stance of someone comfortable in her own body, arms slightly wide. Below them, in the careful, deliberate handwriting she'd been working on since the 3rd grade, our family. Daniel looked at the drawing. Sandra looked at the drawing. Neither of them said anything immediately. Amy set it on the table. I'll get the hammer. They hung it together. Daniel with the level and the measuring tape, because he was constitutionally incapable of hanging anything without confirming it was truly straight, and Sandra holding the upper right corner while he measured, and Amy standing back 3 feet directing with the authority of someone who has a very specific vision and trusts it. The hammer went in, the nail went in, the drawing went up. All 3 of them stepped back. Good, Amy said, satisfied. Final. That's where it goes. It's very good, Sandra said. Her voice was entirely steady. It cost her something to make it so. She paid it. Daniel looked at the drawing. 3 figures. One small word below them that contained everything that mattered and nothing that didn't. He thought about the empty space that had been there. About Amy at 12 with her feet in the sand. About a workshop in September and a woman in silk who had driven 4 hours alone and arrived with a document and a deadline, and had somehow, in the process of trying to save one thing, found another. He reached over and took Sandra's hand. Not for any audience, not for any record or any camera or any board of directors or any cousin running out of legal options. Because her hand was there, and his hand was there, and it felt like the right thing, which was the only reason anything real ever happened. Because real things didn't require explanations. They required presence. And he was present, and she was present, and the drawing was on the wall. She held on. Amy looked at their joined hands, looked at the drawing, appeared to run some internal calculation, decided the calculation was complete and satisfactory. I'm going to go check on Mr. Patterson's cat, she said. His name is Biscuit. He bites people who are nervous, but he's fine if you're calm. She paused at the door. I told him about you, she said to Sandra. He knows you're here now, he'll be fine. The door closed behind her. The evening came in through the windows. The particular October evening of coastal Georgia, warm still but with something in it that wasn't summer anymore. The specific quality of a season that has decided to become something else and is doing so without drama. Sandra looked at Daniel. This man she had found in an archive record from 1987. This man who had been in this house, in this workshop, building things that lasted and raising a daughter who read every assigned book and had put a drawing on the wall that said our family, long before she had driven 4 hours to knock on his door. I have something to tell you, she said. He waited. Barbara Langston called you before she called me. She said it evenly. The delivery of someone who has been holding information and has decided the time for holding it is finished. She told you about Dorothy, about the clause, about what it actually meant. She looked at him. You've been sitting on that since Saturday. He didn't deny it. I was waiting for the right moment, he said. This is the right moment. I know. Tell me. So he told her. All of it. Barbara's voice on the phone in the early morning. The explanation of what Dorothy had actually constructed and why. The specific love of a woman who had watched her granddaughter become extraordinary and efficient in equal measure, and had understood that these were not the same thing, and that one of them was quietly crowding out the other. Sandra listened without interrupting, all the way to the end. Then she sat with it for a moment. The particular silence of someone reorganizing everything they thought they understood about a decision that had felt like a trap, and was turning out to have been all along a door. She knew I wouldn't do it on my own, she said finally. She knew you needed permission, he said, or something that functioned like it. A deadline. She almost laughed. Not quite. She gave me a deadline because it was the only language I wasn't capable of arguing with. She looked at the drawing on the hallway wall, visible from where they stood. The three figures. The careful handwriting. She used to say that love isn't what you feel, it's what you build. Her voice was very steady. I spent years thinking she meant the foundation, the properties, the archival work. A pause. I think she meant something else. Yeah, Daniel said. I think she did. She looked at him. And then, because 4 months had passed and she was done managing the sentence, she said it plainly. I've been in love with you since the first day. Since you told me not to use Amy to close the deal and then didn't ask me to leave. She held his gaze. I needed 4 months to stop running administrative control over that fact. Day 1, he said. Day 1. I knew on day 11. He said it with the precision of someone who has counted and is not embarrassed about counting. When you stayed up until midnight helping Amy with the Georgia History Project, and got glue on your blazer and didn't say a word about it. You counted. I'm a precise person. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had hung a drawing with a level, and driven her to board meetings and waited in parking lots and turned down $5 million without pausing to consider it, and had known since day 11, and had waited, with the particular patience of someone who builds things that last, for her to arrive where he already was. He kissed her. Not for any audience. Not at the end of a ceremony or the beginning of a narrative, or in view of any camera or any cousin or any investigator with a long lens. Because she was there, and he was there, and they had both, finally, completely, chosen the same thing. When they stepped back, the hallway was quiet, and the drawing was on the wall, and the house was the house it had always been, except that it contained something new. Not new the way things are new when they arrive. New the way things are new when they finally settle into the place they were always going to occupy. Amy appeared in the doorway. Biscuit was fine, she said. She looked at them. I saw that. She pointed, still not making it weird. Just nodding. She tilted her head. I called it on day 2, by the way. When you didn't do the face. This last part addressed to Sandra, I told Dad. He didn't believe me. I believed you, Daniel said. You said we'll see. That's believing you. Amy looked between them one more time. Something in her face did the thing it did when she had assessed a situation and found it satisfactory. The verdict of someone who has been paying close attention and whose close attention has been vindicated. Good night, she said, and went back to her room with the complete self-possession of a young woman who has arranged things to her satisfaction and has other business to attend to. The door clicked shut. Outside, the October evening continued its slow work. The live oaks held the Spanish moss in the dark. Somewhere 2 streets over, a screen door opened and closed. The workshop was dark and quiet and full of the accumulated hours of a man who had been building things in it for 14 years. Things that lasted because he cared about what they were made of, and how they were put together, and whether the grain was running true. 4 months ago, a woman had walked into that workshop with a contract and a deadline, and the absolute certainty of someone who believed that sufficient preparation was a substitute for presence. She had been wrong. Spectacularly, permanently, beautifully wrong. And Dorothy Whitfield, who had kept sand dollars on her desk for 40 years, and had known her granddaughter completely enough to love her into a corner, had counted on exactly that. The chess move made from love. The deadline that was actually a door. Sandra looked at the drawing on the hallway wall. Their family, in careful pencil, on a Sunday afternoon by a young woman who had decided it was time to make room, who had watched the whole thing from day 2 and had known. Would you treat them with kindness? With the certainty of someone who paid attention to where people sat and whether they did the face and how they treated the things that mattered, that this was going to be the answer before either of the adults involved had worked up to asking the question. Daniel reached out and took her hand again. She held on. Not for the cameras, not for the board, not for 14 months of scrutiny or any legal record or any cousin who had finally run out of moves. Just because. Because this was real, and real things didn't need a reason beyond themselves. Because she had driven 4 hours to a stranger's workshop and found something that wasn't a stranger. Because a woman who had spent 40 years building something true had loved her granddaughter well enough to engineer a collision between her most careful plans and the one thing no plan can account for. The right person, in the right place, who simply refused to go away, and who she had, in the end, been brave enough to let stay.